think the two core issues really is that predictive power and explanatory power, and really sort of grappling with our one-to-one experience of the world, rather than sort of often the speculative metaphysics that other approaches try to do. Which I think the problem that approach runs, those other attempts to explain reality run into, is that we can never discern whether those perspectives are imaginary or actually capturing something real. There's some problem with that even with the scientific method to a certain degree, because most of what what we experience is processed through our faculties, and those are problematic. But science, at least as far as I understand it, has functioned to sort of get underneath many of our assumptions and actually show those assumptions to be incorrect. As opposed to other worldviews, which seem to sort of, oh, this seems to make sense, and therefore let's build sort of a story off of these assumptions that we are comfortable with. I guess that's what I would say.
Okay. Yeah. Can I kind of push on that a little bit? I just want to make sure I have a really kind of clearly defined picture of what you mean by the scientific method, because I think that's what we're going to start talking about a good bit next.
Sure.
Sort of, because I think that is in a sense a worldview. And actually, I think that's what I heard from you as you described the scientific method was sort of a very a lot of different kind of parts without like a single definition. And so I saw you talk about approaching things with the least number of assumptions, empirically observing the world around us, and using that to kind of guide our understanding of the world around us. Creation of models.
Let me give you a more because I just looked up the specific definition, right, which I agree with. It's a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation of testing and modification of the hypotheses. This includes, like I was saying earlier, the value of explanatory and predictive power. Maybe that's a better way of framing it, more clear way of framing it.
Okay. So if I could try and put that in my own words, what you mean by the scientific method is acquiring knowledge by systematically observing the world around us and weighing the value of a proposition based on explanatory power and ability to predict things. That's what you mean by the scientific method?
Yeah, and the framework which allows us to test our hypotheses, make experiments, and also sort of the falsifiability of hypotheses. Like, it's a good thing that any hypothesis in science that we can come up with, well, we could falsify them. And that's the point of the experiments, is to show does this idea actually hold up to the data that then we can gather from doing experiments and engaging with the world.
Okay. And I heard you make the statement, it is the best way of acquiring knowledge. I think that might have been what you used. I can't remember.
Yeah, I have some problem with the term knowledge.
Okay.
I think probably.
I guess I should have checked that from your screen name.
Yeah, like, it really is a matter of semantics. I mean, there are many people in philosophy that just think of knowledge as justified true belief. I don't know if I think knowledge is not really. I'm more comfortable, and it might be just a preference, to just say what justified beliefs do we have? I don't call it knowledge, right? Because when I think of knowledge, I think of certainty. Instead I think I call it a justified belief given the tools that we have, and given the condition that we're in. And I think science is the method, or sort of the framework which does that far better than anything else. I don't think any other approaches even come close to doing what science does.
Okay. I have like one or two more questions, then I think we can both just kind of throw our worldviews out there and get
Sure.
to it. As you say, science is the best way. Do you think there are exclusive, like, do you think there can't be simultaneous systems going on for a person for understanding the world around us or arriving at those justified beliefs? So in other words, if you're operating on the scientific method, can you also simultaneously be operating on some other system, or is it exclusive? Does that make sense as a question?
I'm not sure, because I think people think about reality differently all the time. Like, you can be a scientist who applies the scientific method, and then in the context of religious belief, completely abandon the same sort of rigor that you would upload. But if you're asking if I think other approaches we can derive knowledge or good reasons to believe in a proposition through other means, other than maybe the exception of certain types of logic, and even that, because I think of logic and language as this descriptive, I also kind of think that it's the result of our experience of the world. I don't think that things like, for example, personal anecdotes or personal testimony, or certain kind of, even if how would I say this, transformative experiences, like in the context of Christianity, for example, I don't deny that there are people who found Jesus and are far happier now, or have felt like their lives have been transformed. That to me is more that's more illuminating of psychology than external truths or facts about reality. I've read philosophy books that have completely transformed my view and my experience of life, and there was nothing supernatural about it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it kind of does. I guess what I'm getting at, the way I see it, science has a scope, just like everything has a scope. So science is really good for describing and finding justified beliefs for certain things, but isn't what I would use to come to a conclusion or come to a justified belief in other areas of life. And maybe that's because I'm just using the wrong definition of science. But
so what would you use?
Well,
what I guess specifically, what are you referring to?
Yeah, so this is kind of a dumb example, but just to kind of sort of just point out what I mean by scope. If I wanted to know someone's favorite food, I would ask them. And I don't think that's a scientific method. There's a different way of coming to a piece of knowledge or a piece of justified belief. That is a different kind of justified belief. It is just in a different category of things to know or things to understand. And so there's a different kind of line of reasoning for that. That's kind of a off the top of the head example. I don't know how far or not far to take that one, but all that to say, I think there's a scope of things science answers, but different questions have different means of thinking through them.
So I would agree that there's a scope. I don't agree that I think anything science can't answer, I think other methods can't either. Okay. And I think other methods approaches to answering those things are actually worse, far worse. Your example about ice cream, I think still seems to me to be of a certain empirical nature. I'm not sure that would be that outside of the realm of sort of gathering information the way that a scientist would necessarily.
Okay.
But yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I think I'm probably going to, as we continue to go into this conversation, I'll probably have some catching points, and that's I would figure stem from different understandings of what we mean by the term science or scientific method.
Sure.
So I think if we get a point where we're butting heads or missing each other, that might be a good thing to kind of circle back to and see what we mean. But yeah, I guess I can go ahead and lay out my perspective and worldview, and we can start kind of hashing into it. But as a Christian, I think the world and the entirety of the universe was created by God. Within that, I think humans were created distinct in His image, with the ability and the role to control and cultivate the world in which we live. In our present state, humanity is in a condition of rebellion against God. And God has, in the person of Jesus, begun reconciling humanity's rebellion to Him. And so, kind of looping back to what we've been talking about so far with the idea of how that fits as a worldview that explains the human experience, that covers, of course, existence and being a thinking person that perceives the world around us. But that's where we really get into uniqueness and the ability to make claims and the ability to understand and interact with the world around us and control the world around us in a distinct way. To me, makes more sense if we do in fact occupy a unique position established by God. To me, that makes more sense than to say that uniqueness that we have is actually illusory, is an illusion. And of course, I think that's where we already butted heads a little bit in terms of the nature of our uniqueness. And that'll continue to probably be difficult here. But that's my, at a very kind of boiled down level, I'd say that's my worldview and how it explains the human experience of our uniqueness.
Right. So I guess what I would say is, why do you think that makes more sense? Like, how this is the problem for me, which is, we can agree with the uniquenous, but we can probably look
I think
at
we
the world.
don't totally agree with the uniqueness. And sorry, I interrupted you.
So we agree that it's a thing, but we disagree on what explains it. And from my perspective, I don't mean this to sound rude. I don't know how to say it without it coming off a little bit. I don't know, but what I hear are claims. What I don't hear are justifications. The entire framework of Christianity, for me, from my perspective, makes very little sense. If God wanted, for example, I don't see the need for a God that wants sort of the relationship with His creation to be redeemed. Why would it be necessary to send Himself or a version of Himself on a suicide mission of sorts, to do what? It also depends on how you interpret it. I mean, some people interpret it as, God was trying to show how He loved us by sharing our suffering. Other people think that literally Jesus' death erased our sins, which to me is immoral because I see it as a scapegoating. But all these things, ultimately, the question that matters to me is, what justification do you have to say that this is reality? Mm-hmm. And my justification is, we have a method that doesn't start off with assumptions. We have a method that dives into our condition and tries to make the best sense of it by gathering data, by experiments, by being able to make predictions, by creating models that ground the hypothesis into something more constructive. If you want to say that God explains the uniqueness, I would just say, well, why and how? Because it just seems to me like, yes, I mean, we can have premises, but how do you justify those premises? That's where I think the problem lies for me.
Right. And so all the things you've listed, I think each of them could have their own conversation, and throughout history have had conversations that go like above and beyond my pay grade. And so as we lay out all that and all the different questions of how does that all work, I'm not gonna try and answer all of those because I don't have the knowledge to answer all of those. I think that's where I want to try and keep it boiled down to what we've talked about so far in terms of the human experience and which worldview gives a more satisfactory answer to that. And so from my perspective, humans have this unique position, and that seems very, very self-evident. We're distinct, and the scientific method and a naturalist perspective doesn't provide the grounds to fully explain why we have this unique position that we're in. And that kind of, yeah, anyways, I'll leave it at that first.
Well, the thing is, like, I don't understand where that opinion comes from, because I think not only does it do exactly that, but it does it to a much more extensive, particular degree, with far more explanatory power. Let's compare sort of the history here of our approaches, right? God and gods, from my perspective, were an invention to try to explain the mystery of life. So you don't know how fire takes place, or you don't know what a storm is. You're going to project certain, humanistic features like anger, and believe that God is angry with humanity, and that's why there's a storm. So, what is a storm? Well, God is causing it. Until you get people who are not satisfied with that assumption, who look at reality on a deeper level, and actually understand that no, storms are something, this much more complex, and these are, the ways in which, why it is that storms appear, and it's broken down in real concrete ways that actually are explaining the phenomena, not just putting on, God. Well, what is God? Well, we don't really know. We can't really fully access what God is, other than some vague thing, but God is, is doing all these things. To me, that's not an explanation. It doesn't have any explanatory power. It's just something people just say. When I look at, we're talking about uniqueness, from my perspective, that's entirely explained by biology and chemistry, and our role in sort of in the world. There is nothing left over from understanding evolution that leaves our ability to self-reflect, sort of this huge mystery. I mean, yes, consciousness to some degree is still an open question. We haven't fully understood where that comes from. But that to me is like, the God of the gaps. It's like every time that we thought God was an answer, and then we looked deeper, we found something that explained things better, or explained things in actual detail. So for me, just to say God did it doesn't really explain anything. And if you want to say that God created us with this uniqueness in mind, my question is, how do you arrive at that conclusion and know that your belief is not imaginary as opposed to reflective of what's actual? Because I can say, well, I can explain uniqueness by looking at evolution, looking at the way which brains developed to be able to perceive and conceive of things that are on a more complex level than other species. Like, these are all things that we can particularly look at in detail through science. And you're saying that, no, this doesn't really explain it as much as, I have this book that says God did it. Like, you get what I'm saying?
I think so. I think so. And so I feel like the first thing I'd say is I don't look at God that way to begin with, as an
Okay.
explanation for the unknown. And so to start in that capacity, that God is simply an explanation for the unknown. Well, now we know the unknown, so it wasn't God. I don't. I To me doesn't seem like a great definition for God.
Well, just to clarify, I'm not saying that
Mm,
therefore that disproves God. I'm not saying
right.
that. I'm
That's
saying
kind of
that
the
it's
agnostic thing, right?
yeah, it's an extra assumption that is unnecessary.
Right. And so that's where, yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm going like two or three different directions at once. I'm trying to figure out where I want to go. Um, yeah, let's see. Sorry, just going back through my outline really quick of what you've been saying. Yeah, I think that's where it circles back to seeing God. Oh, is our God-given uniqueness not at odds with our God-given constrained biological context? I honestly don't understand that as a question. If we want to talk about that, we can. Otherwise, I think I know where I wanted to go now.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So that's where I think it goes a step back into a worldview where, how do I put this? Where I think there are more questions that need to be answered other than simply how the world works. Because as I see it, that's what science does, is it describes a lot of how without really describing much of the why. That science, as you like the examples you cited of, say, thunderstorms, or I guess that's the only one I remember, but weather patterns. All science does is describe the interaction of a bunch of variables and how they correlate or don't correlate. But what it hasn't done and doesn't do is describe why. And so as we look at the idea of human uniqueness, yeah, science can do a great job of explaining sort of how we got to the point of humans occupying a unique position. But at the end of the day, it doesn't explain why we find ourselves sitting here as the only beings able to wrestle with questions of truth. And I think that's where assumptions are still happening. And the assumption is there's no answer to that question of why, but that's still an assumption. Does that make sense at all? I'm not sure if I'm making sense to myself.
No, I get what you're saying, but I think there's some problems here. One, because to me, the why becomes the how. The two questions are actually not as distinct. Unless you mean, well, why is it that the laws of physics are what they are in the first place? Like, why is it that things are what they are as opposed to something else? Even if science could answer that, I think you could always sort of extend it. Well, why that, as opposed to? But I think that's the wrong question to ask. I don't think. I think this is what Wittgenstein talks about when he's referring to sort of questions that actually lack real meaning or content. You're assuming that there is a why. You're assuming an intention, and that is an assumption that I don't make. And even if there was some sort of actual why, whether it's a naturalistic explanation or a supernatural explanation, it seems to me sort of almost naive to think that we could find that answer. And so I'm okay if the question even makes sense, which I'm very skeptical that it does. I'm okay with saying I don't know. Like I think, given our circumstances, given the evidence that actually exists in the world, from which we should build a worldview that is coherent with the information that is present, the why is not accessible to us. And I think anybody that says that they have a worldview that has answered it really is running into the problem of, you are not, again, I don't put words in your mouth or say this is just my perspective of religious people in general, and not just religious people, but most ideologies. I'll even extend it to. Most people believe what they believe not because they have good reasons, but because they want something to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And so they construct they're trying to construct a narrative, and they take in information to try to fit, to sort of push the data or reinterpret the data in a way that will fit what it is that they need and want to be true. And I think that's primarily what science doesn't do. Science is trying to disprove itself all the time. How would we ever know that the why you've arrived at is actually real and not imaginary? Let's say that you want to say that the reason, the why for the uniqueness is because God made us in His image, and He made us with a purpose, and that's why we're what we are. How do you know that is not just a fantasy? Like, how do you know that's actually reality? I'm not saying that I know it to be false. I'm saying that there's no methodology that you can point to that can bridge that gap, that can get us to the potential and imaginary to the actual and real. That's why I said earlier that whatever, I can agree with you, there are certain questions science can't answer, potentially. But if that's the case, no other methodology can answer those questions either, because all they're doing is making assumptions and creative narrative.